The wind carried ash that morning, not from fire, from something older, something that had already burned down and settled into the earth and been walked over by enough generations that no one remembered what it was or what it had once held. The woman standing at the edge of the courtyard knew. She did not speak of it. She had learned long ago that knowing and speaking were two entirely different dangers. Her name had been changed. The record would not say when. Records rarely marked the exact moment a name disappeared. They only showed what replaced it. This is how empires work when they are finished with armies. Conquest has always carried a second phase. The first phase is visible: smoke, movement, the collapse of walls. The second phase is quieter, slower, and in many ways more permanent. It does not require soldiers. It requires administrators, clerks, household managers, marriage brokers, men who understand that the longest-lasting form of control is not fear, it is integration. In the ancient world, warfare produced human inventory. It was not spoken of in those terms openly, but the organization behind it followed an inventory's logic: sorting, categorizing, assigning, distributing. When an empire defeated an enemy, the human spoils were processed the same way as grain or gold. There was a system, there were people whose function was to maintain the system, and within that system, certain captives held a category unto themselves. Women of status, daughters of defeated rulers, wives of men who would no longer be husbands, sisters of men who would now be vassals. They were not simply taken, they were evaluated. The distinction matters. Random violence is chaotic and unproductive. Evaluation is purposeful. These women were assessed not for what they had been, but for what they could still become, what they could stabilize, what they could produce, what their names, however newly changed, still carried in terms of bloodline and political symbolism. The battlefield ended at the city gates. The real strategy began inside the palace walls. Historians have written at length about marriages between ruling houses. The familiar framing involves diplomacy, kingdoms linked by shared children, alliances cemented through union. It is a tidy framing. It omits the architecture of coercion beneath it. When a defeated king's daughter was brought into the court of the conqueror, it was not described as forced. The language used was almost always the language of honor. She would be elevated. She would join a great house. Her children would carry noble blood. The language was careful because the language was part of the mechanism. If you describe absorption as elevation, the subject of that absorption has fewer grounds to refuse. Refusal becomes ingratitude. Resistance becomes a failure of comprehension. This was not accidental. It was craft. The Roman Empire practiced this with extraordinary administrative precision. Captured women of provincial aristocracy were absorbed into Roman households as wives, concubines, or educated companions to children of the ruling class. Their languages were discouraged, their religious practices were managed, restricted, permitted in diluted forms as a concession that always stopped well short of full expression. Their children were Roman. The record said so. The children were raised to believe so. And by the time those children had children of their own, the question of origin had become merely decorative, a heritage mentioned at festivals and nowhere else.
Conquest turning into lineage control. It was not metaphorical, it was policy. The hostage system deserves its own reckoning. It was presented, in the courts that practiced it, as a form of guarantee. A defeated ruler would retain his throne, his title, sometimes even his army, on the condition that his daughter or his sister or his son lived within the walls of the imperial capital, not as a prisoner in any formal sense, as a guest, as a ward. The language, again, was precise in its misdirection. Wards were educated, they were fed well, they were given access to culture, language, music, ceremony. They were also entirely without the ability to leave. The Byzantine court maintained this practice for centuries. The Mongol Khanates systematized it across a geographic span that encompassed dozens of distinct cultures. The Ottoman court, in its early expansion phases, kept the daughters of newly absorbed Balkan and Anatolian nobles within the palace complex, not as slaves in the crude sense, but as permanent residents whose presence ensured the continued cooperation of their fathers and brothers beyond the walls. A father who might consider rebellion would pause. His daughter was inside. His daughter was watched over. His daughter's future, her marriage, her children, her status, was in the hands of the empire. This was called hospitality in some documents, generosity in others. The word that was never used was what it actually was, a living guarantee of obedience, human collateral, stored carefully, treated well enough that the arrangement could be spoken of with a straight face. The Achaemenid Persian court took daughters and sisters of subject kings to Persepolis, where they lived within a compound that was architecturally indistinguishable from comfort, but functionally indistinguishable from a cage with gilded bars. Alexander of Macedon, who dismantled that empire and built the infrastructure of another, inherited not only the treasury, but the logic. His successors, the Seleucids, the Ptolemies, each reproduced the pattern with local variation. The form changed, the function never did. What no document recorded was what those young women understood, that the kindness was conditional, that the education was a form of replacement, that every lesson in the imperial language was a lesson away from their own, that every ceremony they were expected to attend, dressed in the imperial fashion, was a rehearsal for a self they had not chosen, that by the time they were given in marriage to a lord of the conqueror's choosing, they had been so thoroughly shaped by the imperial household that the transition felt, to them, almost natural.
That feeling of naturalness was the achievement. It was the point. An empire that had to use force to maintain every subject was an empire spending itself into exhaustion. An empire that had reformed its subjects from the inside, beginning in childhood, beginning in the household, beginning with the daughters of the defeated. That empire had found a form of control that did not announce itself. Control that felt to those inside it like simply the way things were. The reproductive dimension of conquest is the one most systematically avoided in mainstream historical narratives. It requires facing something that feels uncomfortably modern in its implications, which is perhaps why it tends to appear in academic footnotes rather than in the chapters they support. Empires understood, with varying degrees of explicitness, that the fastest way to stabilize a newly conquered population was to produce children who belonged to both sides, children who carried the bloodline of the defeated but bore the name, the faith, the language, and the loyalty of the conqueror. These children were not accidents of circumstance. They were the intended output of a deliberate system. The Mughal court, in its period of territorial expansion, produced a governing class whose genealogies reached into Rajput, Persian, Timurid, and Central Asian lineages simultaneously. The mothers of these hybrid elites were not randomly acquired, they were selected. Their fertility was the asset. Their cultural background was the raw material being processed. The children they bore would rule territories their mothers' fathers had once defended. This was called consolidation, political biology dressed in the language of dynasty. The effect extended beyond the first generation. The children of captive women occupied an ambiguous social position, elevated enough to be useful, hybrid enough to be managed, never quite belonging fully to either origin. This made them, from the empire's perspective, ideal administrators. They had no pure allegiance to defend. Their identity was the empire's creation. Their loyalty was, by the nature of their formation, structural. The empire did not need to force their cooperation. It had manufactured their worldview.
Inside the household, something stranger and more intimate was occurring.
Captive women who survived long enough, who adopted well enough, who produced children that lived. These women became the primary educators of the next generation of rulers. Not formally, not with titles, but in the way that all early childhood education operates, through presence, language, habit, the texture of daily life. The language whispered at night, the prayer said quietly before sleep, the story told in the voice of someone who remembered another world. These were not political acts in any organized sense. They were the residue of identity refusing to be fully extinguished. Historians who have examined the childhood households of rulers in the Ottoman, Mongol, and Byzantine periods have noted consistent patterns. Future rulers who spent their earliest years with mothers from conquered populations often retained unusual fluency in languages their official biographies did not emphasize. Some showed religious sensitivity toward populations their courts officially regarded as subject. A handful corresponded privately in languages they were never formally taught. The empire had placed these women inside the household to transmit imperial culture. What it had not fully calculated was that culture does not travel in only one direction. The woman shaped to carry conquest forward also carried, in her body and her memory and the way she held a child in darkness, something the empire could not document and therefore could not confiscate. Soft power inside the palace, weaponization through domestic space. The conqueror had designed it, the captive had found the gap within it. There were also the public ceremonies. The Roman triumph, the procession through conquered cities following a military victory, the deliberate display of captive populations, walking, chained or not, dressed in the clothing of their origin, identified by signs that named their people and their defeat. This was not incidental pageantry, it was structured political communication directed at multiple audiences simultaneously. To the Roman population, the procession said, "We have extended, we have absorbed. These people, once threats or unknowns, are now property of Rome." To the subject populations along the route, it said, "This is what resistance produces." To the foreign courts who received reports of the ceremony, it said, "This is what we do to the defeated. Adjust your calculations accordingly." Captive women in these ceremonies occupied a specific symbolic role. Their presence was not merely one element in a larger display. Their presence was the statement. A defeated people whose women walked through the conqueror's streets had lost something more permanent than territory. They had lost the private sphere. They had lost the household. They had lost the boundary between the world outside, which empires always fought over, and the world inside, which most cultures understood as the last inviolable space. Displaying captive women in triumph was the empire saying, "There is no inside left. We have entered everything." The Assyrian palace reliefs that survive from the 9th and 8th centuries before the Common Era depict this with stone-cut precision. Processions of captive women, some nursing children, some bound, all visible, all named in inscription by the people they belonged to before they were made to belong to Assyria. The Persians developed similar ceremonial vocabularies. The Romans refined and exported the tradition until it became, across the Mediterranean world, a recognizable grammar, a set of images that communicated empire's total reach to anyone who had seen it performed, even once. Gendered humiliation as political messaging. It worked because it communicated on a frequency that did not require translation. Every culture that practiced it understood what the display meant. Every culture that witnessed it understood the same thing. The conquered understood most of all. The law followed. It always followed. The legal architecture surrounding captive women, their status, their rights, their capacity to hold property, to inherit, to divorce, to retain custody of children, was not left to improvisation. It was codified, it was maintained, it was updated as empires expanded and encountered new categories of captive that the existing law had not anticipated. Roman law created precise hierarchical categories for women taken in war, distinguishing between those who could be formally married into citizen households and those whose status remained permanently sub-civic. Byzantine law inherited and elaborated these distinctions. The The various Islamic legal traditions that governed expanding caliphates developed their own codified categories for women captured in military campaigns, some provisions offering protections that exceeded what contemporary European systems provided, others establishing restrictions that institutionalized permanent disadvantage. The point is not to rank these systems against each other. The point is to recognize that none of them were improvised. Every system of conquest that lasted more than a generation developed a legal framework to manage what happened to captive women. The existence of that framework reveals the scale of the phenomenon it was managing. Legal scholars of the medieval Islamic world debated, in some cases across centuries of jurisprudence, the precise conditions under which a captive woman's previous marriage was considered dissolved, what waiting period was required before she could be taken as a wife or concubine, what rights she retained in theory even when practice regularly overrode them. The debate itself, sustained, detailed, occasionally protective in its conclusions, is evidence of how many women these laws were being written to govern. You do not build a legal architecture around a rare exception. You build it around the volume of cases that require management. When something is large enough to require consistent law, it has become infrastructure. The restrictions on movement, the limits on property, the rules governing what a captive woman's child could inherit and from whom. These were not cruelties added to a neutral system. They were load-bearing elements. They held the architecture of dominance in place across decades, across generations, across the natural deaths of the men who had originally ordered the conquest. Institutional normalization. The bureaucracy outlasted the sword. Long after the general who had ordered the campaign was dead and buried and turned to legend, the laws he had operated under continued to process women through the same categories, the same status distinctions, the same inherited logic. The individual actors were replaceable. The system had been designed not to need them. Power, however, does not distribute itself according to the intentions of those who first deploy it. History records, with some discomfort, the number of women who entered imperial households as captives and left, in the only way that mattered, through time and positioning, as the most consequential figures in the politics of their age. The mothers of heirs held a specific and poorly understood form of authority. They held it not through title, but through proximity, timing, and irreplaceability. A ruler who was 6 years old had one mother. That mother was present in ways that ministers were not. She was trusted in ways that advisors could not manufacture. She had access to the ruler's formation, his fears, his attachments, his private beliefs that no amount of political maneuvering could replicate. Empires knew this. They managed it through restrictions, through surveillance, through the careful placement of loyal household staff around prominent royal mothers. But surveillance requires human beings to conduct it. Human beings could be persuaded, could be sympathized with, could themselves be gradually shaped by the woman they were placed to watch. The harem politics of the Ottoman court during the 16th and 17th centuries, a period later historians called the Sultanate of Women, offers the most documented example of this dynamic. Women who had entered the imperial household as captives from the Caucasus, from the Balkans, from the territories around the Black Sea, rose over decades to exercise direct influence over military appointments, diplomatic correspondence, and succession decisions. The empire had taken them as instruments. They had become, through survival, strategy, and the particular leverage of motherhood, participants in the governance of the empire that had taken them. This was not what conquest had intended. Strategy, backfiring in subtle ways. Power is rarely one-directional. The system that created the weapon could not always control where it was eventually aimed. What is most absent from the historical record is the interior. Documents survive when they are maintained. They are maintained when they serve the interests of whoever holds the archive. The interior life of a captive woman, her grief, her calculation, her private accommodations with a reality she did not choose, was not the kind of thing empires transcribed. What survives are the edges, a letter that mentions a woman's previous name before correcting itself to the new one, a legal proceeding in which a woman's origin is named as a complicating factor in a dispute about her children, a religious record noting that a household member had to be instructed more than once in the proper form of prayer. From these edges, the interior can be inferred. Identity was not erased quickly. It was pressed, it was managed, it was surrounded by systems designed to replace it gradually, to make the original self inconvenient, uncomfortable, finally silent. The silence was read by those who had engineered it as evidence of successful conversion. It was not always conversion. It was sometimes survival.
Silence as self-preservation. The woman who did not speak of what she remembered was not the woman who had forgotten. She was the woman who had learned, precisely and at cost, the difference between memory as private possession and memory as public vulnerability. She kept the one, she surrendered the performance of the other. This is a form of resistance that leaves no monument. It does not appear in the records because it did not need to. It was interior, intergenerational, passed through the exact domestic channels the empire had intended to use for transmission in the other direction. A story told at the wrong time, a name used in private, a way of marking a particular day that could always, if questioned, be explained as something else. The archives are silent on this. The absence in the archives is not proof of absence. It is proof that some things were carried in ways that archives were never designed to hold. Empires expanded through armies. They endured through families. This is not a metaphor. It is an operational description of how territorial conquest was converted into lasting dominance. The soldier took the city. The administrator organized the spoils. The marriage broker positioned the captive. The household trained the child. The child grew up speaking the conqueror's language, praying in the conqueror's manner, inheriting the conqueror's categories for understanding the world. By the second generation, the violence that had initiated all of this was already fading into what would eventually be called history. History, in the version maintained by empires, rarely preserved the mechanism. It preserved the outcome, the dynasty, the bloodline, the cultural synthesis, and described that outcome in language that made it seem like a natural development rather than the product of a system. The system was the point. The system required women, not as incidental casualties of warfare, not as unfortunate byproducts of conquest, as components, as load-bearing elements in the architecture of imperial continuity. Their absorption was designed, their cultural reformation was managed, their fertility was cultivated, their silence was enforced. Their influence, when it emerged despite all management, was at once a failure of the system and proof that the women inside it had always been something more than instruments. They endured inside the machinery of empires that had calculated everything except the full dimensions of what it means to be a person who refuses, even quietly, even invisibly, even in the small hours of a morning no one was watching, to become only what they had been assigned to become. Conquest is never as complete as the conqueror believes. The record is never as total as the archivist intends. Something always escapes the ledger, not because the system failed, but because human beings are not the kind of material that systems can fully process. Identity is not a document to be seized and replaced. It is not a language to be prohibited and forgotten in a generation. It moves differently. It stores differently. It survives in forms that institutions are structurally incapable of detecting because institutions only know how to look for the things they already know to look for. The records do not say this. The records were kept by the empires. But the edges of those records, the small corrections and the noted resistances, and the legal proceedings that reveal lives more complicated than they were supposed to be, those edges say something else. Something that was never meant to be read. Something that was buried under enough stone and enough silence and enough renamed daughters and enough amended registers and enough official ceremonies that it was supposed to have disappeared entirely and without remainder. It did not disappear. It was never going to disappear entirely. It waited.